The message is heaven sent. That's really what I want to talk about. But in the Gospel of John, I want to read for you the first 13 verses. Listen to them. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He was not the light. He only came as a witness to the light, the true light that gives light to every man who was coming into the world. He was in the world and through the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. As I was reading that text while I was overseas a few days ago, I thought that verse there, that verse 13, so much like the virgin birth itself. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or even a husband's will, but born of God. Merrill Tenney, the famed professor and scholar of years ago, gives an introduction to the Gospel of John that is riveting. It made an impression upon me in my undergraduate studies, and I found the book dished out where I had underlined it. And I want to read for you 2 or 3 paragraphs of what it is Tenney says about the Gospel of John. There are themes that emerge: light, darkness, belief, unbelief, reasoning, logos, argument, and the beginning that God himself could only explain. But there are 2 other themes that actually emerge, and that is the fact that this message is heaven sent, and he was a heavenly sent messenger to bring to us this message, and that you and I are now those witnesses. The idea of a martyr, the martyrion, is the concept that keeps emerging. But listen to what Tenney says in 2 or 3 paragraphs. There are 2 aspects in this story, because there are 2 aspects to the person of Christ, the human and the divine. As a portrayal of human struggle, the Gospel of John is a deep tragedy. All the worst of human passions and behaviors, all the utmost of human suffering and failure are adequately set forth. Jealousy, avarice, hatred, envy, lust, duplicity, disloyalty, ingratitude, stupidity, brutality, hypocrisy, spite, and every other evil motive or quality are illustrated in the actions of this drama. Conversely, unselfishness, generosity, kindliness, purity, honesty, sincerity, and self-sacrifice may also be found. Apart from divine intervention, as in all great tragic literature, evil would triumph, and in the crucifixion, the tale would have ended sadly and disappointingly. More than this, the tragedy is ironical. The more humanity struggles against evil, the more deeply it gets involved in it. For instance, Peter avowed that he would never forsake his Lord, but that he would lay down his life for him. The exact opposite occurred. In the life of Jesus himself, irony is apparent. Although he was virtuous, he suffered all possible indignities. Majestic, he died in ignominy. Powerful, he expired in weakness. Particularly is this fact illustrated by his claims as they contrast with his end. He claimed to possess the water of life, but he died thirsting. He claimed to be the light of the world, and he died in darkness. He claimed to be the good shepherd, and he died in the fangs of wolves. He claimed to be the truth, but was crucified as an impostor. He claimed to be the resurrection and the life. He expired sooner than most victims of crucifixion usually did, so that Pilate was amazed. Strangely enough, the culmination of his career seemed to give the lie to its intended meaning. If the greatest exemplar of righteousness that the world has seen became a helpless victim of evil, then supreme tragedy is the burden of the Gospel of John. But from the divine perspective, the fourth Gospel is not tragedy, but triumph. The plot reveals victory of life over death, of love over hate, of light over darkness, and of the Spirit over the flesh. The true culmination is not in the crucifixion, but in the resurrection. Unbelief does its worst at the cross and halts there. Faith holds on to the resurrection and so becomes victorious. The divine word has not triumphed by being revealed in contrast to the world as a mystic vision untouched by the sordid realities of life, but rather by undergoing the worst that life could do and by rising above it unscathed. Nor is this vision splendid only in a dream by which men delude themselves into thinking that they triumph over the world, though actually they do not. Its call to faith produces a new practical reality for daily living. What an incredible introduction to the gospel given so many decades ago. That it seems to end in tragedy, yet through the eyes of faith and the knowledge of the gospel writers, there is victory that doesn't circumvent or get aside all of these debauched expressions of the human mind, but they go through it and comes out triumphant on the other side. You see, it's not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, said James Stewart. It's through it that God actually triumphed and conquered. And so as we look at what it is that God is calling us to do in a time like this, I think of that famous essay of F.W. Borum, The Candle and the Bird. And he talks about in these terms. He said, you know, if you turn the light out of a candle, you extinguish it, there is darkness. He said, but if you frighten a bird, it'll go and sing its song on another bough. He said, the gospel is more like a bird than it is a candle. You cannot really extinguish it. You push away and resist the Holy Spirit, he will go and do his work in another part of the world. And you see this happening repeatedly in history. When Addison was mourning the loss of Puritanism in England, at that very time, Count Zinzendorf, with his little band of young men in their 20s, were meeting at Herrenhut and launched the Moravian movement. It was the Moravians that inspired Wesley. It was the Moravians that inspired William Carey. In fact, when Carey threw down the gauntlet in front of his leadership, he had the annals of the Moravians put down at the table and said, they're sending missionaries all over the world. Why aren't we doing the same? The day the cross was being burned at Notre Dame in France, the very day in Paris, William Carey was setting his foot on Indian soil. And there he baptized Adoniram Judson, who went on to Burma. And then his wife translated the Bible into Thai, and the Burmese Bible and the Thai Bible came about just through the Judson family, and it was through the inspiration again of Carey. The bird is singing its song in many parts of the world. We are not extinguishing the candle. We are just watching what the bird is doing, and in the different boughs of the world that it is singing its song. How does this happen? How does this come to be? It's going to be my privilege to speak in a few parts of the world at the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which was so ably mentioned here by Oz a few moments ago. Just think about it. 500 years have gone by. And Martin Luther took his stand and said that unless through Scripture he could be challenged and be proven wrong, he would not recant. But I want to point out a real nuance in that Reformation movement. We know there were many, of course, Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, then there was Huss, then there was Savonarola, and then there was Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, so many of them like a tidal wave moving and changing history at that time. But it was 1973, when I was in East Germany with John Warwick Montgomery, who was doing a Reformation study tour. I remember walking to the Castle Church there. standing outside the door. It was in the days of the Cold War, and very predictably, being December, it was foggy and cold and clammy. And I stood in front of the Castle Door Church and wondered what must have been like for that man to come and nail those 95 theses to the door, beginning with the words, "Out of zeal and love for the elucidation of the truth, the following theses will be debated." Out of zeal and love for the elucidation of truth, the following theses will be debated. There's a book written about Melanchthon, who was the theologian of the Reformation, and it's called The Unrecognized Reformer. See, it was he who pointed to Luther that the word penance really meant repentance. It was he who graduated from university in his teens. He went in at 13, graduated by 16. In his early 20s, he was a professor of theology at Wittenberg. In his early 30s, he wrote the Augsburg Confession. Martin Luther describes himself in contrast to Melanchthon. "I am rough, boisterous, and stormy. I am born to fight against innumerable monsters and devils. I must remove stumps and stones, cut away thistles and thorns. But Master Philip comes along gently and softly, sowing and watering with joy according to the gifts which God has so abundantly bestowed upon him." Melanchthon said of Luther, "If there is anyone whom I dearly love and whom I embrace with my whole heart, it is Martin Luther." And the biographer says this about both of them: "By his fiery eloquence, his genial humor, and his commanding personality, Luther commended the Reformation to the people. By his moderation, his love of order, and his profound scholarship, Melanchthon won for it the support of the learned, the lovely, and pleasant in their lives. They toiled, prayed, and suffered for the same great cause, and in death they are not divided. They literally lie side by side in their graves at the Castle Church in Wittenberg." They died at the same age, 63, except Melanchthon was younger by about 14 years, so he preached at Luther's funeral. And as I walked into that church, I thought to myself, these guys were young men. They took on the world. They challenged the world. They stood with the Word of God, and though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed His truth to triumph through us. The Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we shall endure, or can endure. One little word will fell him. Amazing change of the course of history, half a millennium ago. Is it impossible for God to do the same at this time in history, through teams like this, through the lives of people like Edmund and Oz, and those who've gone on, who've left a legacy, people like Francis Schaeffer and so on. So I want to talk to you very quickly. What are the challenges we really face in our time? The first one I hesitate to talk about because it's not a subject I like to often get into. But, you know, a few days ago, I was, I think, somewhere in, I don't know which country I was in, somewhere overseas in Asia. It's about 10 days ago. And Ruth on our staff sent me a lead article in a student newspaper, in one of the leading newspapers in the leading universities of this country. When I read it, I started to cry. I said, I can't believe what I've just read. I cannot believe what I've just read. And then I thought to myself, how did this even come into my email? There were so many four-letter words sprinkled through it, in the crudest form of sexual indulgence. From autoeroticism to polyamorous relationships, name it, it was there. And this young gal who's writing in a newspaper as a student, verbally voyeuristic, telling everything of all she does and all she's done from the time she was a young teen. Is this why you go to a university to graduate with letters against your name? To tell everybody all the struggles you have in your private world, only not talking about his struggles, but in a cavalier way of indulgence and sexuality. And so it is, oftentimes, the Dawkins and the other in the world will tell you what it is they're really hostile towards in the Christian faith. It is because they consider us morally repressive and restrictive of this kind of indulgence. I want to say to you something. I became a Christian at the age of 17. I played cricket for my university. I played cricket in a local club. I was very competitive in sports. I didn't know a single Christian on my cricket team or my hockey team. They're all Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists. Some of them may be. Not one of them would have read that article and found comfort or inspiration. They would have all said, this is bizarre and perverted. But the Christian faith takes the hit for it. And so what we are really living with at this time is a kind of sensually driven culture that has actually come to believe that you find your nirvana or your moksha or your salvation in indulging in this body in any form you want to indulge. You will find happiness in it. Yet read the life stories of people like Ernest Hemingway and others who ultimately lived out to a total life of impotence and found that the most frustrating part of them was that the very thing they lived for had nothing to give for them anymore. This is what we're up against. We're up against a young culture that has spent itself and exploited the human body to a point of, yeah, we all fail. As young people, we all struggle. We all think there is some hope in something. And where you talk to people and you see they come away empty-handed, disconsolate, guilt-ridden, and pained by all of the things that they indulged in. And yet you go to the intellectual bastions, and that is their answer for nirvana and hope. And so it was in 1974 when Malcolm Muggeridge resigned from the University of Edinburgh and gave his farewell address there at St. Giles. This is what he said. So, dear Edinburgh students, this may well be the last time I address you. And this is what I want to say to you, and I don't really care whether it means anything to you or not, and whether you think there is anything in it or not. I want you to believe in that this row I have had with, it all had to do, by the way, at that time in the 70s, of handing out condoms free to the university students. And so he says this, I want you to believe that this row that I have had with your elected officials has nothing to do with any puritanical attitudes on my part. I have no belief in abstinence for abstinence's own sake, no wish under any circumstances to check any fulfillment of your life and being. But I have to say to you this, that whatever life is or is not about, I think this is the line that I love so much. Whatever life is or is not about, it is not to be expressed in terms of drug stupefaction and casual sexual relations. However else we may venture into the unknown, it is not, I assure you, on the plastic wings of Playboy magazine or psychedelic fancies. This was a man who'd lived on the other side of the tracks and is telling the young, it's not where you're going to find it. Whatever life is or is not about, it's not about casual sexual relations and psychedelic fancies. And yet we've got a whole generation moving in that direction. All over the world. One of my favorite professors in my graduate days was Carl F. H. Henry, one of the most brilliant theologians, American theologians of years gone by. I remember in one of his books he said this, and I wondered, wow, this is something for Henry to be saying it. I wonder why he's saying it this way, but he did. He said this in his book, Christian Mindset in a Secular Society. Biblical truth, transcultural as it is, has an indispensable message for contemporary culture. It addresses modern learning, modern ethics, modern political, economic concerns, and all the idolatries of our polytheistic society. It proclaims the gospel to a generation that is intellectually uncapped, morally unzippered, and volitionally uncurbed. Those who consider the latest fads permanently in will, of course, dismiss the Christian message as the last hurrah of an antiquated outlook. They reveal their sickness of soul by derogating terms like morality, piety, family, work, patriotism, born-again, evangelical theology. Christianity they dismiss as a kind of middle-class hedonism, declaring it intellectually inadmissible. They meanwhile espouse a life that neither reason nor conscience or spirit can support or condone. Repression of sensuality or self-gratification they call psychotically abnormal. Subordination of the flesh they leave to medieval monks or consigned to the future resurrection. Affirming sexual pleasure to be the supreme good of a life of unending revelry, they waste away into ethical ghosts and skeletons. So it is. So who we got railing against our president? Hollywood. Hollywood has hardly been a symbol of puritanical virtues. The only time they criticized too much violence on the screen was when Mel Gibson's movie came about on the crucifixion. They said that was too violent. That was the first miracle that movie attained, by the way, getting Hollywood to think it was too violent. Wasting away into ethical ghosts and skeletons. We are living at a time where our children and grandchildren are going to be told they make their choices on all of these matters. There are no absolutes, nothing at all to which they need to get anyone else's advice or permission. There is the indulgence of the physical, but there is then the seduction of the intellectual. What has happened is not so much that people are driven in this direction. We all struggle, we face these issues, I realize that. But the intellectuals today have railroaded this thing and commandeered relativism into a camp where anybody who believes in any norms and any absolutes is considered unfit for contemporary society. That they are dinosaurs, they ought to be gotten rid of. And yet I'll tell you what, our team will tell you when we go out there and speak, and even on these matters, the young people, especially the young women, are listening with riveted attention. They know what you are saying is right. They just don't seem to have the power and the will to honor that. I remember two young gals at one of the leading universities. Vince was with me. He'll remember this very well. The gal came up right up to the platform and she was asking her question, and we knew what her question was and what her lifestyle was and what she was driving to. But she was extremely respectful. She had gained our respect in the process and was raising her question. And I could see the tears going down her face as she was asking her question about her personal struggle. And Vince did a marvelous job after I finished answering. And then she asked if she could come to the back and speak to us, she and another young gal. And there they were with tears running down their face, admitting to what it was that their real battle was. And then paid us the great compliment and said, would you two men mind if we took our pictures with you? And there they were, standing next to us, of a completely different worldview, completely different habit in life, knowing that they didn't have the answers, but desperately needed it through Christ, as we had the privilege of praying with them. This intellectual hijacking of hedonism today and giving it some credibility. So you've got the marvelous minds in all these halls of learning who are so relativistic and hedonistic in their pleasures and so anti-Christian in their approach. Paul Johnson, in his book Intellectuals, probably overstates it somewhat, but he makes this point. One of the principal lessons of this tragic century, which has seen so many millions of innocent lives sacrificed in schemes to improve the lot of humanity, is beware of intellectuals. Not merely should they be kept well away from the levers of power, they should also be objects of particular suspicion when they seek to offer collective advice. Beware of committees, conferences, and leagues of intellectuals. Distrust public statements issued from their serried ranks. Discount their verdicts on political leaders and important events. For intellectuals, far from being highly individualistic and nonconformist people, follow certain patterns of behavior. Taken as a group, they are often ultra-conformist within the circles formed by those whose approval they seek and value. That is what makes them en masse so dangerous, for it enables them to create climates of opinion and prevailing orthodoxies, which themselves often generate irrational and destructive course of action. Above all, we must at all times remember what intellectuals habitually forget, that people matter more than concepts and must come first. The worst of all despotisms is the heartless tyranny of ideas. It was the French philosophers, the French intellectuals, who drove ultimately till splendor rode hard, or till victims were riding hard on the backs of splendor and so on, and might became right, and all of the words and the guillotine and all that came about came about on the heels of so much intellectual rejection of the absolute and the value of ultimate human life. And so we have the attraction of the physical, the seduction of the intellectual, which brings me to my closing here. We really have to have three very simple responses. They have been addressed. So I'll just mention the first two and apply the third. In our mission, why are we here? Why are we here? What does this organization exist for? Why do our churches exist? What is my life amounting to? Why does RZIM exist? As it turns out, within a few days, I'll be celebrating my 71st birthday. Entering your 7th decade of life is a grim reminder that you're closer to the finishing point than to the starting point. You recognize the years have gone by so quickly. So I ask myself the question, what is it now I want to focus upon? There's something within me that prompts me to say, your work is done. Your work is now done. You have labored hard for over 4 decades in the vineyard. Shut the suitcases, sit at home, go down to your desk, write, enjoy the family every day. Oh, it is so attractive a thought. But then I look at the world around me and I say to myself, what is my mission in life? What did God call me for? Why did He rescue me from a hospital bed? I look at it and I say, it is to be in the arena where the battles are being fought and to try and win the best of the youth today to change their world and to change the world to come. And I believe we are going to see it happen.